Whoop, excuse me. All right. Okay. All right. There's kind of a little more light here, but I'm going to do my best. So I'm excited to be here today as we commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Modoc War. Thank you all for turning out, especially in the approaching inclement weather here. And let me also thank David and Jessica for asking me to come here to speak today, as they know I'm always excited, well, if somewhat obsessive about talking about my research. And so I really appreciate them asking me. So I'm going to have to repeat some of what she said. My name is Dr. Robert David. I typically go by Dave. I'm a member of the Klamath tribes, and I'm a contract archaeologist with a research specialty in Klamath Basin rock art. Currently, I work as a lecturer or a adjunct professor at Portland State University. This thing is just irritating me. Adjunct professor at Portland State University, where I did my master's work, and then before attending UC Berkeley, where I ultimately did my dissertation on Klamath Basin rock art. I guess I could probably go like this. There we go. Sorry about that. Now, before we can go any further, I know I'm going to crack this up. Okay, there. Suppose I should address the elephant in the room. Some of you may be familiar with my last name, David. I'm a descendant of Alan David, who was chief of the Klamath Indian Reservation during the time of the Modoc War. He's my third-time great-grandfather. Now, with that being said, I wasn't actually here to talk about Alan or the Modoc War today. I was actually invited here to speak about my research on Petroglyph Point, Lava Beds National Monument, where I unwittingly have been studying the site for the past 7, going on 8 years now. You can ask me about that afterwards, why I said unwittingly. So with that as a lead-in, let's see if I can get this to work in coordination with me here. Today's talk about Petroglyph Point is going to take me, well, 1 hour and 7 minutes. I've been able to consistently time it at that. I'm going to start off by providing some general information about the monument's, physical characteristics. And then I'll talk about a little bit about some of the earliest inquiries made about the petroglyphs and how answers to these inquiries influenced the research that followed. Now, I'm going to move it a little closer. I don't know how to, but I'm going to move it closer anyway. There we go. There we go. Okay. Let's try that again. Now, after that, better? Awesome. I'm going to spend a great deal of time talking about Klamath and Modoc mythology. And my reason for this is because my main argument here is that myth, when understood through the framework of shamanism, is the appropriate literature for understanding the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs. And then finally, we'll examine some of the petroglyphs within that mythological shamanic framework, and then hopefully have some time for questions afterwards. If we get snowed in, we'll have lots of time for questions. Okay, so, whoops, did I just skip one? I did. So Petroglyph Point, as you know, is situated in the northeastern corner or boundary of Lava Beds National Monument near Tule Lake, California, within the traditional homeland of the Modoc. And the red square at the upper right hand of the slide there shows the site's location within the monument. Now today, as you can see, the petroglyphs are protected by this chain link fence down there. This was erected in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps in an effort to put a stop to the tourists who had literally been chunking off sections of the petroglyphs and then carting them home as souvenirs. Now, unfortunately, the fence doesn't protect all of the petroglyphs, and vandalism has continued to occur even as late as 2013. And this latest occurrence, in fact, is what inspired me to start focusing my research on this monument so that we could learn as much about it as we can while we can. Now, this mountain, sometimes referred to as the island, or sometimes as Prisoner's Rock, is considered to be the very heart of Modoc territory, not only in terms of its location, but also because of its spiritual importance. The Klamath and Modoc both, in fact, regard this mountain as the creation point, where the spirit Kamoosh first created dry land by scooping up clay from the bottom of Tule Lake. And then afterwards, he's said to have created the rest of the Earth's landmass from this point outward, somewhat in the nature of weaving a basket. Now, according to our ancestral beliefs, any place on the landscape where spirits acted or lived are thought to be charged with their supernatural power. And so this mountain's creation by a spirit already makes this mountain a sacred place. And this in turn makes this mountain a place where certain people will travel to in their search for supernatural power. And I say certain people because the markings on this monument indicate that the site was reserved for shamans or kukes, who were the ritual practitioners of the tribe, and the only people in our culture who made and used rock art. Such markings, in fact, were thought to be dangerous and sometimes even fatal to those who were not initiated, by which I mean non shamans. Well, this kind of information, which the earliest researchers weren't really interested in at the time, actually provides us with very significant clues about the nature of the petroglyphs carved all over this mountain. And this, in fact, is what we're going to be exploring throughout this presentation. This mountain's sacred connotations and what they have to say about the petroglyphs. The union has authorized me to take a few coffee breaks, so So briefly, here's some examples of the imagery. And as you can see, some of the glyphs were made with an engraving instrument, like possibly a beveled deer femur or something of that nature, while others were made by incising the rock face with a sharp instrument, like possibly the edge of a projectile point or maybe even just the edge of a sharpened stick. And curiously enough, other images were made by drilling holes into the rock face, sometimes in a way that created patterns, but not always. And I suppose I should mention at this point that this mountain is made up of wilted volcanic tuff, which has the consistency of sandstone. And this, of course, is what made carving and drilling petroglyphs into the rock face so easy. Now, according to the latest estimate, the monument contains more than 5,000 images that range from somewhat naturalistic figures to others that have been called geometric abstract. By naturalistic figures, I mean figures that are more or less recognizable, such as the human and insect forms shown on the far left. The so-called geometric abstract figures consist of things like, groups of wavy lines, zigzags, grids, circles, triangles, bisected lines, and so on and so forth, much like the composition you see over here on the right. Now, looking at these images, especially the so-called geometric abstract figures, it's not hard to see why they've intrigued researchers and teased the public's imagination for well over a century now. I mean, over the years, they've been called things like maps, calendars, astronomical charts, solstice markers, doodling, ancient Scandinavian fish tallies, the writing system of mysterious vanished civilizations, and so on and so forth. Anything but a site created by the Modoc or their ancestors. See, in the earliest days of research, especially right after the Modoc War, when tensions were still riding pretty high, it was just hard for Westerners to accept that this petroglyph concentration had anything at all to do with the ancestral Modoc or even the Klamath. And this, as you might imagine, significantly influenced both the type and quality of research that followed. And in fact, I'd go so far to say as it derailed it, because it sent them off in the wrong direction looking for answers. Anyway, keep this so-called geometric abstract composition in mind as we're going to be returning to it at the end of our discussion today. And my purpose will be to use this composition to demonstrate that the petroglyphs on this monument are knowable. In spite of over a century of claims made to the contrary, these petroglyphs are knowable. And what's more, they're knowable in a Klamath and a Modoc way. This is my claim today. Now, the earliest, throat's going dry. Get excited here. Now, the earliest inquiry about the petroglyphs that I'm aware of came at the conclusion of the Modoc War in 1873. Two military officers had asked an old Indian man what the petroglyphs were all about, and he replied that it was his papas, 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 repeating the word papa, apparently in an effort to convey the site's great antiquity. Now, just a few years later, on the next page, a few years later in 1881, Dr. James Dennison, who was the physician at the Klamath Indian Agency, received a nearly identical reply from the Klamath Indians about one of their pictograph sites near Klamath Lake. The general consensus among the Indians, he wrote, is that Kamokamps had created rock art when he first created the world. And Kamokamps, by the way, is the Klamath name for the creator's spirit, Kamoosh. And I'll be using both names interchangeably throughout this presentation, depending on what source I'm citing at the moment. Anyway, like the Modoc, the Klamath emphasized the rock art's spiritual origins and its great antiquity. Now, as you can see from this quote from Leslie Spears' ethnography around 50 years later, the Klamath continued to deny having made the pictographs at all, attributing their creation once again to the spirit, the Mokamsh. So the common thread here in all these statements is made by a spirit at the beginning of time. That's important to remember. And it will show up on the test. Now, even though these statements didn't make a whole lot of sense to the earliest researchers who inquired about Petroglyph Point, they actually provide us with very significant clues pertaining to its actual origin and purpose. But in order to understand this, we need to first understand the ritual philosophy that inspired both the petroglyphs and these early, somewhat cryptic statements made by the ancestral Klamath and Modoc. And that's because they both stem from the same worldview. That is, they both stem from our myths. For example, let's take another look at this quote from Leslie Spears' ethnography on the Klamath, in which he stated that the Klamath do not make pictographs. The few sites that exist in their country were said to have been made by Kamokamsh, the culture hero. See, Spear had assumed that the Klamath attributed the creation of rock art to Kamokamsh because they were just as unaware of its origin or purpose as anyone else. And this idea, in turn, led him and the subsequent researchers who consulted his work to conclude that Klamath Basin rock art was unknowable, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, simply because nobody appeared to know who actually made it. And as a result, most of the researchers who followed simply assumed that some mysterious Klamath Basin predecessor had made them prior to the arrival of the ancestral Klamath and Modoc, and that these predecessors had either gone extinct or had long since moved on. So subsequently, all the research was focused on discovering the real makers of the rock art, while simultaneously dismissing information provided by our Modoc or Mukluk ancestors. But in actuality, let me just say it this way, what Spear failed to grasp is that those of our ancestors who were contributing their knowledge to his ethnography were speaking from a worldview that was peculiar to most Westerners at the time, a worldview that was deeply grounded in myth, or as we prefer, our sacred narratives. Native peoples, especially the greater North American far west, generally believe that spirits dwell at certain places in the earth, and that when people would ritually tap into their powers, well, they were understood to become those spirits. That is, that the spirits were thought to enter into the bodies of the supplicants and then animate their actions. And so, for example, if they claimed that like a water spirit had made a particular rock painting, they were talking about a person, probably a shaman, who had successfully acquired the supernatural abilities of the water spirit and then made the painting as the water spirit. That is, that the water spirit was understood to be animating the actions of the artist. Well, in our myths, Kamokamsh, or Kamoosh, was every shaman's tutelary spirit, i.e., he was their primary spirit helper. So when shamans made rock art then, our ancestors understood that it was Kamokamsh who was animating their actions. And so from the point of view of Spear's informants, Kamokamsh did in fact make the rock art, even though they may have seen the person of the shaman doing the actual painting. They understood that it was Kamokamsh working through the shaman, and they simply explained this to Spear from their own cultural perspectives. But, sorry, I lost my spot here. But as I said, okay, Spear appeared to miss this important connection between shamans, spirits, and rock art, and thus his understanding fell short. Like others, he failed to consider the sacred ideology that had inspired their answers. Am I too far away again? I see that look on your face. All right. Oh, you paid for that, so I probably should put it up there. I'm actually on the next one now. That's the one. In actuality, rock art is an expression of the spiritual ideology contained in Klamath and Modoc mythology, in the very same sense that a stained glass window from some Gothic cathedral is an expression of Christianity, but with one fundamental difference. See, whereas the Christian materials touch on your sense of aesthetics in order to reinforce the Christian doctrine, well, to inspire, the images that make up Klamath Basin rock art, in addition to doing all the above, also constitute the shaman's toolkit. And by this, I mean that these glyphs and paintings tended to serve very specific roles within the shamanic practice. And once again, these roles are described in great detail in the region's mythology. So, for the past 23 years or so now, which is kind of incredible since I just turned 21 again. Anyway, for the past 23 years now, I've looked to these sacred narratives in order to inform my understanding of Klamath Basin rock art. And I started off doing this for two basic reasons. First off, I discovered it pretty early on that these sacred narratives actually identify powerful supernatural beings. Well, just a casual comparison with the ethnographic materials makes it very clear that these powerful beings of myth are also the spirit helpers that shamans use in their ritual practice. My claim is that these are the very spirit helpers we see depicted in Petroglyph Point rock art. That's what I'm going to attempt to demonstrate this evening. The second reason was that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world, how it operated. For example, everything in the spirit world was inverted or reversed from the natural physical world. Day here is night there. Mountains here are valleys there. What we would call bad behavior in the physical world is great behavior in the spirit world, and so on and so forth. Well, this law of inversion, it also shows up in much of the rock art, and that's, of course, why I chose the image on the right. Now, I'm not completely sure what this figure is, although I do have a couple of ideas. As you can see, this image is actually a true reflection of itself. It's inverted. And it's divided by this here fissure in the rock face. So the concept of inversion is represented here. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that the artist organized these figures around this natural fissure. And the reason for this is because certain fissures and cracks in the rock faces were believed to be portals or access points into the spirit world, which was located inside the earth. So by incorporating this fissure into this depiction, the artist effectively associated these figures with the spirit world. And this, of course, means that these figures were inspired by an understanding of the spirit world along with the laws that govern it. So in short, then, these stories constitute our ancestral worldview. And as such, there's no way we can understand rock art or any of the rituals associated with the rock art without understanding these sacred narratives, because therein lies the ritual philosophy that inspired their creation. So, returning to my first point, I want to turn your attention now to some spirit beings that I've been able to identify in Klamath Basin rock art by consulting Klamath and Modoc mythology. And keep in mind that myth not only identifies these characters, but it also describes in great detail the nature of their supernatural powers, essentially why they appear in rock art in the first place. Now, the first and most widely known of these spirit beings is, of course, Kamoosh. And once again, the Klamath call him Kamokamsh. Now, as previously stated, Kamoosh is our creator spirit, but he's also considered to be the spirit of the sun. All throughout these tales, Kamoosh is intimately associated with the sun disk. The sun disk was his medicine or his spirit tool, essentially his mechanism for wielding certain kinds of supernatural power. Well, by virtue of the sun's regenerative properties, Kamusha's possession of the sun disk both made him immortal and it also gave him the ability to cure or to rejuvenate the sick, and even to bring people back to life, including himself. So this, in effect, identifies the sun disk as an especially effective curing tool. Well, once again, Kamusha is the creator of shamanism, and thus he's every shaman's spirit helper. So by channeling the spirit Kamush, shamans were also able to access the sun's regenerative properties and likewise use them to cure the sick. And in fact, that's the shaman's primary role in the community, to cure by supernatural means. And what this means then is that Kamusha's sun disk was available to shamans as a medicine tool, and this is why we see it depicted in the rock art. It was a shaman's tool, or a mutwas, just as Spear's ethnography had indicated. And attesting to this is the fact that the sun disk had its own spirit song, or what Gatschet here calls a Tamanawash song. Tamanawash is Chinookan jargon for medicine, spirit power, that type of thing. See, incantations or spirit songs are the primary means through which shamans invoke their spirit helpers. To invoke a spirit or a spirit's medicine tool like the sun disk, they had to have the proper song given to them in a dream by that particular spirit. And in fact, Gatschet's observation here about shamans singing to painted rocks indicates that these paintings depicted their spirit helpers. And the reason I can make this claim is because among the Klamath and Modoc, the concepts of singing and spirit being were one and the same thing. Our ancestors made no distinction between a spirit or its medicine song. And in fact, as Spear points out right here, one word was used to describe both simultaneously, Swiss. So singing the rock paintings then was the same thing as invoking spirit helpers. And this, once again, is why we see the sun disk depicted in the rock art. My claim is that shamans were invoking its supernatural properties to cure sickness, because that's how Kamush used the sun disk in myth, recalling that he is their spirit helper. I'm about to fly out of the seat. I get excited talking about this stuff. Better see if we got a seatbelt in the house here. Now, another powerful spirit described in these narratives is Skell, the mythical pine marten. The pine marten is a tree-dwelling animal characterized by its elongated body and its triangular head. Now, like Kamush, Skell was one of the primary medicine spirits in myth, and accordingly, he also had a number of spirit songs, which shamans used to invoke him into their ritual service. Now, in some tales, his role was to provide supernatural curing through the use of his medicine stick, which he typically carried behind his ear like a pencil. And in other tales, his role was to help shamans to diagnose the supernatural cause of a disease by scouting the landscape from the treetops, or sometimes right out there on the prairie, keeping a lookout for all these malicious disease-causing spirits that might be approaching the village from afar, or just as commonly, lurking in dark places within. Only shamans could discover these spirits through the use of their spirit helpers, like Skell. Now, like all the semi-naturalistic images that you're going to see depicted in Klamath Basin rock art, Skell was typically depicted in stick-figured form. And this is because the artist didn't want to depict an actual physical pine marten. Instead, they sought to symbolize the essence or the soul of a pine marten, something without flesh, so that the viewer would understand that what was being conveyed here was spiritual rather than natural, and thus they would know to keep away, since this kind of medicine was dangerous to non-shamans. And the way that Klamath Basin shamans routinely express this idea was by depicting only its most basic and recognizable characteristics. In this case, its elongate body and its triangular head. This is an artistic convention known today as synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. And we see this convention used all too frequently in Klamath Basin rock art. And this quote from Spear's ethnography at the bottom of the slide helps to explain why. That gives me just enough time for Now, with that being said, Skell also sometimes is depicted as a stylized human figure. Here, for example, we see his triangular head on top of a human-like body. This is another common convention in North American rock art where spirits are presented in human-like form, essentially animal spirits blended with human characteristics. Now, one explanation for this arrangement is that this figure is a self-portrait created by a shaman who has successfully acquired Skell as a medicine spirit during a shaman spirit quest. And they're seen here as one and the same being because the spirit is possessing and thus empowering its human host. In other words, this is a picture of Skell being actively channeled by a shaman. So, whoever this image depicts in, he or she is presented here as being fully potent to cure by supernatural means, which of course is the very essence of shamanism. Now notice that Skell carries his medicine stick right up here where his ear would be, just like the tales describe. Like Kamusha's sun disk, Skell's medicine stick, you're on cue here. There, Skell's medicine stick had the power to regenerate life. Give me a second to read that. Now, there are still other times when all we see in the rock art is Skell's triangular head all by itself. Of course, this is another example of synecdoche. On the upper left, for example, we see Skell's head, possibly depicted alongside his medicine stick right up here, although this is somewhat obscured by the lichen, so I don't actually know. And on the right, we see Skell's head depicted down here, just below Kamusha's large sun disk just above. And in this case, his medicine stick is missing. Okay. So once again, Skell was used for both diagnosing cases of sickness and disease and for ritual curing by means of his medicine stick. Now, the myths are just teeming with examples of his ritual exploits, and this, once again, is why we see Skell depicted in the rock art. Another spirit associated with the shaman's ritual curing practice is Old Man Mukas, the owl spirit. Now, the owl spirit actually turns up all over in Klamath Basin rock art, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, which you can see over here on the right. Now, what makes the owl so vital to the shaman's ritual practice was, of course, its amazing vision, which enables it to hunt at nighttime. Or in other words, its vision enables it to see things hidden in dark places. And so, by way of metaphor, any shaman who possessed this spirit's extraordinary vision was empowered to see things like hidden, malicious spirits that might be causing sickness and disease. Or to put it another way, the owl's vision enabled shamans to reach supernatural diagnoses. Now notice that the owl's eyes are the primary feature emphasized in the rock art. And in fact, if you notice, the shaman's incantation here makes a very specific reference to the owl's vision, okay, which Gatschet goes on to explain in a little further detail here below. And this quote below is one of several cliff notes in which Gatschet was trying to unpack the cultural meaning of each of the incantations he included in his large ethnographic sketch. And as you can see, his cliff note links the owl's vision directly to the supernatural curing practice. Now, the horned owl seems to be a favorite in Klamath Basin rock art as well as in the Miz, but occasionally we do see depictions of other species as well. This heart-shaped figure from Petroglyph Point, for example, might at first strike the ordinary park visitor as a valentine of a sort. And in fact, a couple of years ago, my partner and I were walking along the fence and listened to a young woman behind us drone on about that very thing, likening Petroglyph Point to a big sweetheart tree. And as nice as that sounds, in actuality, what we're seeing here is a representation of the barn owl. Okay, note the outline of its face. See, in this figure, the artist simply chose to represent what he or she considered to be the most important or defining characteristic of the barn owl. And once again, this is a sort of form of synecdoche. Now, like the horned owl, the barn owl specialized in hunting its prey at nighttime. And this in turn made it an ideal spirit helper. Using the barn owl as a medicine, shamans could seek out and eradicate dangerous hidden spirits that might be approaching the village from afar, or just as commonly, lurking in dark places within. Okay, I waited long enough here. Finally, another very powerful spirit among the Klamath and Modoc is a Skoks. Now, in the myths, Skoks are typically described as being half visible, with the visible portion looking much like a skeleton, or sometimes like an old woman bearing a bundle. But sometimes in the tales, Skoks takes on the appearance of a wood tick. Now, why a wood tick, you might ask? And I'm darn glad you did. Keeping in mind that all sicknesses were thought to have a supernatural origin, the most common diagnosis for an unexplained illness was the intrusive object disease, in which some spirit was thought to have placed a malignant object into a person's body, leading to their sickness. Well, the cure for this was for the shamans to locate the object in the person's body with the use of supernatural vision, of course, bite the patient in that area, and I do mean drawing blood biting, and then remove the object by sucking it out of them. And the final step, of course, was to destroy the object in some way. And notably, all this had to be facilitated by a well-chosen medicine spirit. Well, by way of analogy with this curing procedure, the wood tick made a very suitable medicine spirit to facilitate the shaman's ritual actions as he or she removed the intrusive object. And this, of course, is because ticks, well, what do wood ticks do? They bite their way into your body and suck your blood. Now, note the Klamath incantation here recorded by Albert Gatz-Chet. Certain bugs had a spirit song, and thus a means by which shamans could call them into their ritual service and use them in precisely this way. And hence the words of the song, the incantation rather. And this is why we see wood ticks and other bugs of this nature depicted at Klamath Basin rock art sites, including this stylized wood tick here from Petroglyph Point. And I'm saying stylized because it has too many appendages, indicating that there's more than one being occupying that depiction. Okay, so to briefly reiterate, myth identifies powerful supernatural beings. And once again, these are the same beings that shamans use as their spirit helpers and subsequently depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. That was my first point. My second point, if you recall, is that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world. Now, this is extremely important because it's this logic that both structures and justifies ritual action, including the creation and use of rock art. Now, for those of you who might be familiar with these types of narratives, Indian myths, legends, folklore, that type of thing, you probably noticed pretty early on, they don't follow the linear organization that's characteristic of Western literature, ever. I mean, the story's trajectory changes frequently, it changes randomly. And the characters seldom, if ever, act in a way that you and I might consider to be rational. Anything in these tales is possible. An ordinary bug could be walking down the street eating an ice cream cone, and then suddenly, for no apparent reason, will itself to the size of an elephant. It could talk, it could fly, and it could even change itself into another creature entirely, even to the point of becoming human. And similarly, the people in these tales, while they can fly, they could live underwater, read minds, have conversations with animals, rocks, and mountains, and expect a reply. And they could even recover from death, dismemberment, and even total incineration. Oh, okay, right on. And then go on with their day as if nothing unusual had just taken place. So the world of myth then was very bizarre, and it seemed to operate, well, much like our dreams. In fact, the more you read or the more you hear these tales being told, the more you come to realize that dreams are the organizing principle for these narratives. Now, this is important because what this means is that these narratives are grounded in our concept of the spirit world, which our ancestors believed they experienced during dreams, or certain dreams anyway. So critical were dreams for spiritual encounters that the Klamath and Modoc repeatedly embarked on power quests throughout the whole course of their lives, and the Modoc would call it a crisis quest. Now, on these quests, initiates would venture alone into the wilderness where spirits live, and then spend the next several nights engaging in a lot of counterintuitive labor, whose only payoff was exhaustion and fatigue. And by counterintuitive labor, I'm not talking about worthless labor. That's a misnomer. But I am talking about the kind of labor that brought you no practical physical reward, like the acquisition of food or the shaping of a tool or the building of a lodge. And that's because the only goal for all of this ritualized labor was to induce a dream in which you were visited by spirits and received their songs, their incantations. Other kind of folks would call this kind of a dream a vision or a trance. So in this regard, counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits. Counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits because the resulting dreams placed you on the doorstep of the spirit world where visions and spirit visitations were possible. So how then did dreams give you supernatural power? If you've ever noticed, the landscape in your dreams is informed by your knowledge of the landscape in the natural physical world. Even if you don't recognize a specific location that you're dreaming about, you'll still see mountains, you'll still see trees, grass, buildings, sidewalks, and so on and so forth. So the landscape in your dreams then isn't all that different from the landscape in the natural physical world. It's in your physical limitations that we see the difference. In dreams, you can do almost anything. In dreams, in fact, you're capable of performing the very same feats as the supernatural beings of myth. You can fly, you can live underwater, you can read minds, foretell the future, and you can instantly recover from dismemberment and death. It's also common to visit loved ones who have long since passed away, i.e., gone to the spirit world. And sometimes you can even visit with spirits like Kamoosh, Skell, Jashkai, and so on and so forth. So it follows then that dreams are where you would go for spiritual counsel, or sometimes to acquire for yourself the supernatural properties of spirits. Now, the ethnographer Albert Gatschet stated this idea very clearly in this quote here below. Dreams are to the savage man, as he put it, what the Bible is to us, the source of divine revelation, with the important difference that he can produce revelation through dreams at will. And he was referring, of course, to the power quest. So for the Klamath and Modoc, then, dreams were the source of all things spiritual. And accordingly, myths were told as dreamtime narratives because that's what identifies them as being sacred. Or, in other words, it might be better to think of it like this. Myth is itself a sacred literary style. It recreates the conditions in which the rules are suspended and the magic works. Just like in dreams. So these are stories then of supernatural power grounded in our concept of the spirit world. And thus they constitute the worldview from which shamans drew their powers and their justifications to cure, to control the weather, to see into the future, all those things that shamans do. And just as importantly, myth also outlines the ritual procedures that shamans use to gain access to those powers. And these procedures, as it turns out, included the creation and use of rock art, as we're going to see. Now, at this point, I'd like to say congratulations, you've now been through the gauntlet, because I'd like to give plenty of preparation before we start talking about the rock art. In fact, got to fuel up here. So the 2 points I just belabored are critical for understanding the rock art of the Klamath Basin. So now at this juncture, I want to spend the remainder of our time zeroing in on the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs and start hopefully bringing this all together. Now, in preparation for this, there's just two very, very, very quick things we need to understand specifically about this monument. The first is that our ancestors believed that spirits live within the peninsula or lived within this mountain. Excuse me. Now, in recognition of this, my claim is that many of the petroglyphs we're going to see today depict these very spirits. This is my bridging argument today. The second is that our ancestors believed that shamans could access these spirits through trance or dreams and consult with them on matters related to their ritual practice, the most common of which was ritual curing. Now, this latter point about ritual curing is critical here because it brings us to one of the most important spirits in the shaman's curing enterprise. Okay, a curing spirit that was second only to Kamush himself. And this is a spirit we called Yayahiyahas. Yayahiyahas. Now, Yayahiyahas, according to the ethnographer Albert Gatschet, is the spirit of thunder. And as such, he wields thunder's terrible weapon, which of course is Lamesh, otherwise called lightning. So lightning then is the spirit tool of Yayahiyahas. Now, according to the ethnographer Vern Ray, and he's the one who did the ethnography on the Modoc, lightning was among the first spirits that shamans called upon in any ritual curing ceremony. And this, of course, is because lightning enabled shamans to see what could not otherwise be seen. Lightning, after all, illuminates even the night sky, i.e., it makes the darkness bright. And so, by way of metaphor, any shaman who possessed lightning as a medicine was empowered to see into the dark world of spirits, which of course was located inside the earth. Or in terms of ritual curing, it also enabled shamans to locate and identify the culprit spirits lurking nearby that had brought sickness and disease into the village. So essentially, lightning enabled shamans to reach diagnoses, that is, to locate and identify the supernatural cause of a sickness. Now, if you take a close look at the zigzag in the slide here, you're going to notice that there are a couple of circles appearing right in about the middle, right here. And of course, these circles were apparently meant to depict eyes. And if that's the case, then this image provides us with a very striking metaphor for a shaman's vision supernaturally enhanced by the spirit lightning. My claim is that this figure represents a shaman empowered to see into the spirit world, or at least to see spiritual things that ordinary folks could not see, such as the hidden cause of a person's sickness. So it's for this reason, then, that we see the lightning symbol associated with so many other spirit figures depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. Lightning enabled shamans to see spirits, like Kamush's sun disk here, a shaman's curing medicine. Or like Skell, the mythical pine marten, another medicine spirit. Now note the triangular shape of the head and the presence of his medicine stick right up here. And here we have the lightning symbols intermixed with the field of spirits, like these skeletal figures, which, if you recall, are another manifestation of the spirit Skokes. Another depiction of a barn owl, or at least the top of its head right here, which we know now is another curing spirit. And of course, we have this nucleated sunburst here, once again depicting Kamush's medicine tool, another curing symbol. So Yayahiyahas then, through his medicine tool, lightning, is a spirit that enables shamans to see either the culprit spirits causing sickness and disease, or their own spirit helpers living inside the earth, otherwise called their medicines, which were their remedies for bad spirits. In short, lightning provided shamans with supernatural vision, and Yayahiyahas was the spirit that provided that power. Now, one other thing that the myths tell us about Yayahiyahas is that he has a very strong, if somewhat unbalanced, interest in fire drills and tobacco, especially tobacco. I mean, whenever Yayahiyahas encountered anyone in these tales, The first thing he always demanded was that they feed him tobacco smoke. And that's, of course, how you feed a spirit, with smoke. Well, that part really isn't too much of a mystery, since we know that shamans routinely use tobacco in conjunction with calling their spirits, especially in curing ceremonies. Then what about his other requirement that people carry around their fire drills? I mean, why would a spirit care whether or not you carried around your fire drill? Well, as it turns out, the story of the one-legged one quoted up here in the slide actually provides us with a very significant clue. See, in this tale, a group of hunters were camped on a mountaintop preparing for the coming hunt. Now, at one point during their preparations, the leader of the party suddenly stopped what he was doing and then took out his fire drill and started to spin it in the manner of starting a fire. Now, as he spun his fire drill, the rest of the company joined him as he started calling out to the mountains, seeking spirits to assist them in the coming hunt. Now, as they were doing all this, they had actually intended to exclude Yayahiyahas, which was a particularly powerful spirit that was dangerous, if not fatal, to people who were not ready to encounter him. And at this point, they just weren't ready to see him. I think as the story goes, they'd forgotten their tobacco, which is a big no-no with Yayahiyahas. But before they could instruct their fire drill not to call him, I said before they could instruct the fire drill not to call him, Yayahiyahas appeared, demanding tobacco, as was his custom. I don't think I have to tell you that the rest of the story didn't go too well for these poor hunters. But what's important to note here is that the story associated spinning the fire drill with calling out to the mountain in search of spirits, including the spirit Yayahiyahas, which, as you recall, brings lightning, also known as supernatural vision. Note in the story that spinning the fire drill not only produced a fire, it also produced a spirit. And that is what's going to bring us back to Petroglyph Point, folks. See, we know that the makers of the petroglyphs had either paddled their canoes out to the rock face in order to create their designs, or they walked over the ice when it was thick enough, probably both. Either way, I suggest that they would have had their fire drills with them, especially given its apparent supernatural properties. Because remember again in the story, they not only used the fire drill to start a fire, they also used it to summon spirits. And that's exactly what I think is going on here at Petroglyph Point. My claim is that shamans ritually drilled these holes into this rock face as a means of calling spirits, just like the myth describes. Now, in most cases, you see drilled holes directly associated with particular spirit figures, like the image we see here. Recall what I said earlier about circles representing the sun disk of Kamoosh and triangles representing the head of the mythical pine marten, Skell. This part of Petroglyph Point is where some enterprising shamans sought out contact with these particular spirits by following the conventions prescribed by myth. Now, in this figure here, you can see where the shaman artist didn't simply drill holes as they called out to the mountain for spirits, but they simultaneously created patterns that sometimes took on the form of the spirits themselves, like the diamond chain you see on the upper left side of the crack. And someone can ask me why that's a spirit at the end of the presentation, if you would. And at other times, they work to frame the spirits, like the imagery you see to the right of the crack. Now, in this image here, you can see holes drilled directly into this previously engraved triangular figure. Once again, the head of Skell, the mythical pine marten, a medicine spirit. Drilling holes into this figure was a direct appeal to the spirit Skell. So on Petroglyph Point, then, we see depictions of medicine spirits like Kamoosh and Skell, as well as evidence of shamans making supplications to these spirits, indicated by the presence of drilled holes. Drilling holes was a fundamental part of the supplication process because drilling holes into a rock face and thus not actually trying to start a fire met the definition of counterintuitive labor, which, if you recall, was a pathway to the spirits. And thus you can equate this to a shaman's version of a power quest, whose ritual actions were inspired and informed by myth. That was a mouthful. Give me a second. Now, there's one last thing we need to talk about that involves Yahya, and then I can quit trying to pronounce his name the same way twice. And that's the relationship between rattlesnakes and lightning. And I have to admit, I was unaware of this relationship at first. But then, about 7, 8 years ago now, I came across a curious statement in Leslie Spear's ethnography on the Klamath, in which he stated that the rattlesnake's rattling was believed to bring thunder. And of course, right away, I thought that was a rather weak belief since it was so disprovable. I mean, all you would have to do when a rattlesnake rattled its tail was listen for the thunder. That's assuming, of course, you have the presence of mind to do it at that point. But when it didn't occur, as it very likely would not, well, then there goes your belief out the window. And so I reasoned, why maintain such a weak belief? But then it dawned on me that this statement may have been a reference to the spirit of thunder, which of course is Yahya, and that Spear just didn't realize this the same way I didn't. So, did rattlesnakes rattle bring Yahya? And can we see this in the rock art? Well, we know that we can see Yahya implicated in the rock art by the presence of his spirit tool, which of course is lightning. And so the test for me was, do we see lightning depicted in close association with anything in the rock art that might resemble a rattlesnake? Here we have a rattlesnake that appears to have been depicted in stick-figured form using only straight or angled lines. And I know it's a little hard to make out, so you can see its rattle here, its elongated zigzag body here, and a diamond-shaped head with a protruding tongue here. Now, at first glance, we might easily assume that the artist simply chose to depict this rattlesnake in stick-figured form instead of using curved or wavy lines like we'd expect. But in actuality, what we have here is a rattlesnake that has been transformed into this zigzag figure by the presence of Yahya, so that we have a figure that simultaneously depicts rattlesnake and lightning. And this is how we know that Yahya is present here. Recall once again that spirits manifest themselves by possessing their hosts and thus transforming them. Just like we saw earlier with Skell depicted as a stylized human figure, essentially a human and Skell simultaneously. By depicting rattlesnake and lightning simultaneously, the artist indicated that Yahya, manifesting as a spiritual lightning, was possessing the rattlesnake spirit and thus answering the rattlesnake summons. So in this regard, Spear's observation was apparently correct, at least from a spiritual point of view. Now here we see a similar depiction, but one that also takes the habits of an ordinary rattlesnake into account. Now at first you might think you're seeing two different figures. On the upper left, for example, you see this large rattlesnake's rattle, possibly the act of rattling as suggested by the wavy lines that surround it. And on the right, you see another rattlesnake's body that has been transformed into this zigzag by the spirit lightning. Now, if you notice, both the rattle and the and the lightning body appear to be emerging from two different parts of this large protrusion in the rock face. The rest of the rattlesnake is taken to be hidden underneath this protrusion, just like an ordinary rattlesnake would hide underneath a rock. So the suggestion then is that the artist had used the natural topography of the rock face to indicate that he or she had summoned both the rattle and the lightning spirit from the inside of this mountain, which, if you recall, was believed to be inhabited by spirits. But as you can see, there's still more going on here. All the drilled holes below this composition indicates supplications to the spirits using a fire. Figuratively then, in terms of ritual, defined by myth, we can see that a shaman had used two different methods to summon the spirit of thunder, a rattlesnake's rattle and a field of drilled holes, both of which are mythologically warranted. Oh no, I'm a coffeeholic. Thanks anyway. Thanks for the offer though. Now on Petroglyph Point, we encounter the very same elements. We see a rattlesnake figure with its head here turned sharply upward as though it were crawling into the small crack in the rock face just above it. And in fact, the head is understood to have already disappeared inside of this small, nearly horizontal crack. We see hints of a rattle here that appears to be emerging from this other spalled off section of the rock face, the discoloration just to the right of it. And the implication, of course, is that the rattlesnake is emerging from one part of the rock face and then crawling back into another. So, like you saw on the previous slide, then, the natural habits of an ordinary rattlesnake have been incorporated into this depiction, suggesting once again that it lived inside of this mountain. And over here, we see a series of nested zigzags juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. My claim is that these nested zigzags symbolize lightning, and I'll describe why here in just a moment. And then finally, we see shaman's medicine spirits manifested in the form of camucha sun discs right down here. And if you look closely, we even see some repeated figures like this other rattlesnake figure over here. And we even see some scattered drilled holes, which I didn't bother to mark. But in short, in terms of ritual procedure defined by myth, we see everything we expect to see. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that these lightning motifs are juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. Remember what I said earlier about cracks and fissures acting as portals or avenues into the spirit world. This arrangement provides us with a very striking metaphor for the spirit of lightning illuminating the inside of this mountain, where spirits were known to live. It's allowing shamans to see directly into the spirit world, allowing them to search for their medicines in an otherwise dark place. So here then, with the assistance of Yayakiyahas, some shaman made successful contact with the medicine spirit Kamush, once again indicated by the presence of his sun discs below. Okay, not to put too fine a point on it, give me a second. Now remember this composition from the beginning, when I said we were coming back to. When we look at one of the more complex sections of Petroglyph Point, we can actually understand what's going on here. The central figure, of course, is what? This long rattlesnake motif. And what is this long rattlesnake motif doing? It's cross-cutting this elongated zigzag figure here. Lightning, the symbol of Yayakiyahas. Now we know from our myths why this association is taking place, why these two figures are necessary for the rest of the composition. Now, if you look closely, we also find plenty of drilled holes, which we know now are synonymous with calling spirits. And I've identified just a few sample groupings right here. There are, of course, others. And intermixed with this scene, we find plenty of spirit figures, most of which were in the form of camucha sun discs right here. And again, there are others. And there are other spirits here, too, that I didn't identify. Way too much background information. So once again, we see everything we would expect to see if some shaman had visited the site, made appeals to Yayahiyahas with the rattlesnake motifs, and then, assisted by his medicine tool, lightning, made supplications to the spirits living inside this mountain by ritually drilling holes into the rock face. And then finally, having achieved supernatural vision, their efforts were rewarded by the manifestation of the shaman's medicine spirits, Gamusha sun discs. So here then is where a shaman, following a long and tedious ritualized process, made successful contact with the creator spirit, Kamush. So at the end of the day, Petroglyph Point is knowable. And it's knowable because we have a very strong informing literature preserved in the form of our myths, our long overlooked sacred narratives. Remember, this mountain is basically a lodge for spirits, and shamans came here for generations immemorial in search of their supernatural powers. My claim is that the petroglyphs on this monument depict shamans' medicine spirits, as well as the ritualized efforts to contact those spirits with the assistance of rattlesnake, drilled holes, and yayahiyahas, as prescribed by myth. And what this means is that these are not merely geometrical abstract markings, nor are they doodling, nor are they solstice markers, and nor are they ancient Scandinavian fish tallies. In fact, folks, these markings are the prayers of our ancestors etched in stone. So, to conclude, myth provides us with an effective mechanism for understanding Klamath Basin rock art. But perhaps most importantly, is that it provides us with the potential to understand the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs as our ancestors once did. Thank you. All right, good deal. Thanks. Yes. Are we going to have a mic or just shout them out? Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 The first one is yes. I think. Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, the first question about me having published anything that might give us the public insight into what I said about Petroglyph Point. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, these people are cool. Everybody in there had something over the last 20 plus years of me coming to an understanding of Petroglyph Point, even if it was just a small single glyph site like along the Klamath Lake. Everybody there had something to do with helping to build our understanding of the petroglyphs. Okay, they're cool. Please reserve a little goodwill in your heart for them. The first question was, did I publish anything? I think I mentioned earlier that I unwittingly actually got involved in Petroglyph Point. Some time ago, Annan Raymond from Fish and Wildlife, he's the regional archaeologist, asked me to document and report on a similar site of Petroglyph Point on one of the three mountains. And then to provide him with an interpretive report. Now, understand, I never intended to do Petroglyph Point. And when he said an interpretive report, well, that was kind of daunting because it's thousands of glyphs that are crammed into about 100-meter spacing. But it took about a year, and I got the report done. But every once in a while, I call my girlfriend and say, this is Petroglyph Point all over again. What I think here is we're ended up with some kind of a Rosetta Stone. And by the time I finished it, Berkeley asked me to publish it in their online or in their publication series. The name of the book is called Spirit, Fire, and Lightning Songs. And there's a second half to it, but I forget it now. It's been too long. And so, yes, essentially what I said here was direct insight from that project I did with Fish and Wildlife. As far as preservation, I'm not really an expert in the area, but now that I know they also drain a couple more of the sumps, I think we're going to see a lot more lurse or sediments in the air. There's a lot of bad news heading our way unless we can do something about that. That's as much as I know. Okay. Okay, folks, I'm warmed up. Fire away. Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of going off of work, a combination of work by Bill Hader and Benson and Arlene Benson and Georgia Lee when they were commissioned to do a report on the Petroglyph Point and another rock art site in the monument. And also an excavation report, an excavation done by Leroy Johnson, but reported on by a guy named Garth Sampson, called Nightfire Island, Lake Marsh Adaptations on a something Holocene, this and that. Anyway, a combination of those two reports makes me suspect that it's about 5,000 to 4,500 years ago is the upward age, up to about 2,600 years ago. There was a window there. What especially Hayter and Lee did was using environmental climatic information, lake levels, and of course the up and down shore levels at Nightfire Island to estimate when the lake levels, which periods the lake level were low enough to have made the petroglyphs. Otherwise, they were covered with water. And they came up with three windows of opportunity. For one is in the 6,000 year area, I forget. The second was between 4,500 and 2,600. The third one is from about 500 years on. The reason I picked the 4,500 year level is because at that point in Nightfire Island's history of people using the landmark as, or the land formation as a stopover station for processing their big game kills and whatnot. At that point, villages entered that area and shamanism came with it. And the marked objects that are identified as shaman's objects are identical to the markings we see on Petroglyph Point. So that's where I'm thinking the petroglyphs started about 5,000 years ago. Okay. Yes, yes. Ready? It's my guess, or rafts or something. Maybe built a more stable floating platform, but I don't actually know. Yeah. I no. It's yeah. Well, my understanding is that some petroglyphs were still made during the time of the Modoc War. Now, this is rumor as far as I know, but I can't imagine they would have abandoned it 2,600 years ago. Imagine, especially a site this important. Oh God, you're going to open a can of worms here. um, this is not just a creation point, but this is the point where we transformed from mythological immortal beings and mortality entered the world, and all those mythological beings that gathered there to decide how the world was going to be after the mythological time ended. My argument is became those spirit helpers. This is a place of a lot of pilgrimages. This is too interactive, in my opinion, too interactive of a site for the community for them to have stopped just abruptly making the petroglyphs. That being said, I have to just give you the good old honest, I don't know. Yes. Not all. No, the the caves have a particular kind of rock art. It has more to do with private visions, trances, places where you would go to get spirit power. The Petroglyph Point has that kind of rock art, but it also has the common medicine spirits that they were used to consult for not just curing. They provided a number of services. I chose curing because that's what I have the most information about. So I would say that there's probably multiple uses going on there. I don't think so. And here's where it gets kind of dicey. Was that okay? Can we assume that the area is sorry, you're right, you said that before. Can we assume that the area is more forested given the that I was discussing pine marten and things like that? See, in the Klamath, the mythical pine marten is, or the mythical skell is the mythical pine marten. For the Modoc, skell was the mythical mink because because there was no trees, and so the tails are the same, but they identify that particular spirit differently, probably because of the absence of trees. That's right now the only information I have. Is there any indication that there were hallucinogens made or used to make the connection? There is native tobacco, and there's also a lot of very profuse ritual behaviors like going without food, running up and down hills, uh, piling rocks all over the landscape, a whole bunch of self-deprecating things. Holding your breath underwater for long periods of time. And native tobacco, from what I understand, is pretty potent stuff there. And then there was, of course, the sweat lodge too. And I imagine the shamans, well, shamans also, by the way, had already gone through this, and all they needed to do was sing the proper song. But sometimes the whole ritual arena to include the lava beds, the stacked rocks in the lava beds, and the nearby mountains would have been incorporated into visiting this site in certain special cases. So native tobacco, to my knowledge, is the only hallucinogen or something that's close to it. See a hand way back there. Yeah, I'm thinking there's a hmm, landscape has a lot to do with the configuration. Is there a relationship between Fern Cave and Petroglyph Point? Are they the same kinds of art, or are there differences? I'm thinking Petroglyph Point is more of a multi-use because they would have gone there to consult medicines before. In fact, you know what? If you get a chance to read those very long lines that I, for your benefit, excluded from the presentation, when shamans needed to go consult their medicines, they went to the gathering places of mythological beings. And this is definitely a gathering place of mythological beings. But they would not have gone to Fern Cave because that was for private visions. That's where people went to either in shaman's training or to become acquainted with the spirit world or to reacquaint themselves with the spirit world to maybe renew their relationship with their helpers and whatnot, their spirit helpers and whatnot. That seems to be exclusive there because of the type of rock art we find down there, trancy like rock art. But these are pretty well defined on Petroglyph Point, very what's called iconic rock art that are found all over the basin and usually in outdoor settings. Jessica, I'll make something up. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, yeah. Want me to repeat that? Is there any evidence that the panels were reused and gone over again after they were already carved once, or is that close enough? Okay, I don't know, and the reason being is because typically the water level would rise again, and then it would inundate the petroglyphs, and then of course it would recalcify them, or the white mineral precipitate would stain them again white. And so I don't know. I can't tell you that. Mhm. Yes, yes. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the symbols for the owl's eyes for supernatural vision was just the diamond-shaped outline of its feather outline of the eyeball or the eyes. Now imagine if you wanted a lot of supernatural vision from the owl, if you wanted more than just an added prosthetic, if you wanted a lot of it, you would make more diamonds. Okay, and sometimes you see figures with three big eyes and a big lightning symbol by it, surrounded by owl implications. Sometimes somebody's really trying to say supernatural vision, and this one was directly associated with the crack into the spirit world. That's why I said it was supernatural vision. Yeah. Mm, mm. Well, shamans, okay. Did did you get it? Okay. Uh, Confused about the sequence. Did shamans paddle out to the rock face, or did they pile rocks first? Was that it? Or I don't know. The thing is, there's indications that they would have done both in some cases, but I don't know about all of them. Usually, the piling rocks, there's nothing to pile up on top of Petroglyph Point here. It's not the right kind of rock. You can pick it up with two fingers if you want, the big ones. Um, but um, but the nearest rock source, of course, is those enormous lava fields where there are stacked rocks. So there's an arena there, but I'm not sure shamans would need to do it to consult with their medicines. All they had to do is sing the right song, and in the beginning of any ritual curing ceremony, they also would have smoked their pipe. I don't know if they would have piled rocks every time. I don't know. That's the best answer I can give you. Yes, Todd. Mhm. I think it's pretty unique, actually. I was down in along Clear Lake and found a very distinctive boundary between what eventually was identified as Pit River rock art versus Modoc. It stops at a very solid point and doesn't continue. And but I haven't really compared it with what we see up like in the Deschutes area or anything like that. I haven't done that. So I hate to keep resorting to I don't know, but right now I can see it as a distinct because nobody obsesses over the Camusha sun disk like the Klamath and Modoc do, and that's everywhere, everywhere, and the cast of characters. Well, owl is important everywhere, so you're going to see implications everywhere too. I haven't really looked at those differences in the way they may have expressed it. Mm. Another one. Oops. And mm, we have a question in the back there. I saw you back there. Okay, the first question, of course, was say it again. Oh yeah, men and women. Okay, whether or not shamans could be men and women. Yeah, yeah. Women. We did have female shamans too. Um, Usually after menopause. The Shasta, on the other hand, had predominantly female shamans, and I don't know what their criteria was. The second question, could you say it again for me? Mhm. Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, a lot. Well, shaman. Well, think about supernatural vision on steroids. That gives you clairvoyance for the future. It helps you predict the outcomes of war. Uh, the idea of using mastering malicious spirits to distance kill an enemy shaman to distance assassinations. I mean, their imagination, was the limit there. But like in a spirit with supernatural vision can give you the ability to see culprit spirits causing sickness, as well as finding lost objects, for which, of course, there was a nominal fee in charged, and so on and so forth. If there was anything outside of this, I'm not aware of it. That involved the rock art. There were other objects like canvas and things of that nature, ska, that had different functions, but that's not rock art. It's something else. Oh yeah. Yes. I would think so because the medicine, the cat, where they're does right on. Um, how can I rephrase it shortly here? The certain panels. Oh, did you? Thank you. Tap. I'm getting another gray hair here. Um, um, my guess is because of the how easy it is to scratch a petroglyph with your bare fingernails, it probably wouldn't have taken as long as you might think. But I would think that especially if let's just say old Dave here had a medicine out there on Petroglyph Point and revisiting it from time to time, that sounds reasonable. And of course, it would have inundated with the water and turned white with the rest of them, so you couldn't see the difference, the age difference. Well, I would imagine they would have visited their medicines frequently, or at least whenever they needed to, unless yeah, and then of course new ones would have been created over the years, or if they needed a different configuration of that medicine, like maybe owl's vision wasn't what they needed. They need owl's tenacious abilities with its claws to root out a disease or whatever. I mean, so you might have to create another owl symbol somewhere. But I would say that yeah, they probably went back and revisited them. I don't know this. I don't have any evidence for this. I could just see it being a reasonable thing to do. Unless we can get some kind of superimpositions that give us some kind of relative local dates. I haven't done that kind of work yet. I'm just still a little overwhelmed by what I'm seeing there. David, you had let's see, get my knee surgery for one thing. No, yeah, actually, some friends of mine in Chiloquin found another rock art site up by up north, kind of in the Yamsey area. And we had what I wanted to do was to do a community project on that one. And one, because there's lots of mythology that applies directly to that site. And so, because I mean, well, I can't really say much about it because it's private land there. The other project I have is I am planning a documentary on Petroglyph Point as soon as I get the 5 minutes to myself to finish writing it. I've been working on it for years, but I keep getting tasked to do other things. And I'm about half done with the book on Petroglyph Point. But the documentary was going to be another community-based participatory research type of a endeavor because what I said in the blurb is that we forgot the rock art. Well, we did well through no fault of our own, we forgot it, but we didn't forget the Miz, and that's where the answers are. That's my argument. Those people who want to agree with me are going to be invited to share and make another documentary because they know the Miz. If the Klamath and Modoc know anything, it's their mythological heritage. And I think my function in history is just to connect the dots between that and the rock art and demonstrate that we didn't actually lose it. You didn't actually forget it. It's still there. And because they will know it and they have actually seen it. I mean, some of them were pretty excitable whenever we get to go out and look at rock art because of it. So I wanted to make it a community-based project. So it's not all about me. The tribe actually remembers this stuff. They just don't know they do. Yes, yes. Hmm. I'm not aware of that. Is there any correlation between the petroglyphs and the big face rock, protruding face rock coming out of the back of the mountain? I'm not aware of that. So I don't know. I can't say. All right. Well, leave your quarter at the back of the table, the back table there. Thanks a lot, folks. Well, that sounds good because now I'm hungry. Thank you, sir.